welcome, my friend, to the Minnesota Gardening Podcast. Thank you so much for being with us here today for episode 12. If you are liking the podcast, please take a moment whenever you can to go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the podcast, and please give us a rating and review so more people can find us. It really does help a lot to make sure that other folks can find the podcast and help share more about Minnesota gardening and grow this podcast listenership. So thank you so much for doing that. Now we have a really great guest for you again here today. It was absolutely awesome to talk with Sven Sundgaard about winter weather. We are now officially in the meteorologic, at least, winter season here in Minnesota, and it is really important that we have some snow cover and different things like that for our plants and for what's going on outside. And we talk a lot with Sven about climate change and what we can expect to see this winter and what he forecasts for our long-term winter season here in Minnesota. So we reference a lot of different links and a lot of different information that you can find on our website at minnesotagardening.com/12. All right, today we have another awesome guest to talk about winter weather here in Minnesota and what we can expect this winter of 2021. And today we have Sven Sundgaard with us. He is we settled on the title kick-ass meteorologist, and he is a meteorologist working really hard in Minnesota, doing a lot of different things. And he's also on Bring Me the News as the meteorologist, and just all around great guy. So Sven Sundgaard, thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to talk about weather. And so with this in Minnesota, there can be any variety of different weather phenomena that we see throughout the course of a winter. One winter can be very different from the next winter and all of that. Where do you expect us to be going this winter?
That's a really good question. And I know we're talking about climate change at some point too, but every element of trying to forecast winter and understanding what could happen in the winter is really closely tied with climate change. So we have to preface that because, first of all, we have to define what are we comparing ourselves to? If we're saying it's going to be a cold or warm winter, that's everybody's first question, right? Well, compared to what? Because our winters are changing faster than any other time of the year. We are actually, of the lower 48 states, Minnesota is seeing the fastest warming of the lower 48. Alaska's more because it's in the Arctic. So we have to define what normal is, because our normals now are actually, we are 2.5 degrees warmer than we were from the historical average. So in the Twin Cities, for example, our historical average goes from 1873 to now. So if you pick that middle point sometime in the 40s, we're 2.5 degrees warmer than that. And even, what is pertinent to gardening, for example, you want to know, okay, what's the new normal? What's the climate like now? And so you probably talked about this. We have a new set of 30-year normals that are now 1991 to 2020. And that is 0.6 degrees warmer than the previous 30-year normals that were 1981 to 2010. And so each of those is warmer than the last. So if we're comparing it to the new normal, I think we're going to have a pretty right in the middle normal winter in the context of our new winter. If you remember, last winter was overall fairly mild, but we did have those couple of weeks in February that were pretty brutal that brought down the averages. Before that hit, we were running a few degrees above average, even for the new normals. So that was a very mild winter. December was warm. January was sort of off the charts warm, and not in the crazy 50-degree days, but that consistent, most of the month was in the 30s for highs. It was just that consistent warmth. It was more like Seattle instead of Minneapolis. We didn't get the real cold outbreaks. We didn't have sub-zero temperatures. And then February, we made up for it. You can decide which is better, getting it all in a couple weeks or spreading it out. But I think we're going to see a winter that's going to be very close to normal. Probably pretty eerily similar to last winter. There are several things that affect our climate, and Minnesota is a highly variable place, as you alluded to. We can go wildly from one thing to the next, especially in the winter. It's our most variable time of year. As we head into the summer months, you're usually pretty confined to 70 to 95 degrees, but obviously in the winter, we can experience anything from 20 below to 50, literally, in the same month. That is more than possible in the month of January. So because we live in the middle of the continent, we are far from mountains, we're far from oceans, things that modify the climate. we're literally at the mercy of several different climate phenomena we look at. One, a lot of people have heard of our El Nino, La Nina. There's the Pacific decadal oscillation. There's the Atlantic oscillation. There is the polar vortex, the Arctic oscillation. There's all sorts of these different major factors that we look at. And because we're in the middle of all of those, they can all influence our climate. And so the complicated part for meteorologists and climatologists is, okay, well, they all influence us the year, or is one stronger than the other, and that might influence us more than the other. So we have to sort of sort through all those things. And that's why I think it's going to be kind of a wash this year. We are in a La Nina year, which we were last winter. And for some reason, there's a misconception that's gone around that we get colder winters in La Nina years. And it's really a very mixed bag, which tells you that there's not a strong correlation on our climate. About half of La Nina years, we have a cold winter. About half are actually mild. The factor that is much more influential on our climate are El Niños, the opposite of La Nina. When you have warm waters off the west coast of South America, that is literally about 3/4 of El Nino winters are milder than normal, and a lot of times much warmer than normal. So when we see that we're heading into an El Nino period in the winter, you don't have to look at anything else almost. You can say warm winter for Minnesota. But La Nina is a little more complicated. Now, what I will say, what's interesting in a statistical analysis is when we have back-to-back La Ninas, so this will be our second in a row, the statistics change a little bit, and it does favor a colder than normal winter. So that while last year was slightly warmer than normal, again, compared to our modern climate, we may not be quite as lucky this year. So it might be slightly cooler than last winter, but I wouldn't look at anything groundbreaking. I know it's still scarred in our heads, the polar vortex winter 2013, 2014, which was the last winter that was actually colder than normal when we look at the historical average. We've had a couple winters that have been very close, just slightly below normal when you look at the new 30-year normals. But when we look at the overall averages, that was the last winter that was legit cold, no matter how you looked at it.
How do we factor in those major swings that we have? Because it seems very much like, I'm going to pull the old man card on this here, but like growing up, it was just consistently cold. I grew up in Northwest Iowa and had significantly more snow in the 80s and early 90s than they're getting now and that kind of thing. And how do you, as meteorologists and looking forward in these times, how do you factor in those massive swings that we have, as opposed to the winter's going to be pretty much average, but we're going to have massive cold spells, or we're going to have storms that are much more violent than they have been in the past? How do those kinds of things play in?
Well, again, we have to look at a climate element. So it's not just your imagination or my imagination. I was a kid in the 80s, and we remember, a foot of snow was not an uncommon occurrence. Whereas when we look at the historic average, that's a pretty outlier snowfall for us. That is not something that we average in a winter, even, which might surprise many Minnesotans. 12 inches is about a once every other year average occurrence. So it's pretty rare that we get those big storms. So Minnesotans like to say, oh, those people in the Northeast, they can't handle it. No, their storms are legit bigger, but they're just warmer so that foot of snow doesn't stick around in New York City, or 2 feet. A nor'easter is a legit storm. That's why I think we're obsessed with the Halloween blizzard, because it was our only storm that was truly a crazy one that matches something like what, New York City can get every couple of years. Imagine getting a Halloween blizzard. We're exceptional. Every other year. Yeah, we want to own the winter card, and we do own it when it comes to cold. I mean, there's nowhere other than Alaska in the United States that gets the kind of cold that we can get, just because, again, our position. If you were to literally walk from here to the North Pole, you'd have a pretty easy time of it. Other than some polar bears, it's relatively flat, and that makes it just super easy for cold Arctic air to dive south, and there's no open bodies of water along the way to alter it. So, those wild swings are just a normal part of our winter, and that's not anything new. That's always been the case. We've had some very mild winters in the 1800s, and then back to back with some brutally cold and snowy winters. But the climate change element, the thing that might surprise people is, while winter temperatures are warming pretty dramatically, we're also seeing increases in snowfall. A warmer atmosphere just holds more water. So we've been seeing this in terms of, in the summer, it's in the form of these extreme downpours. You know, what used to be, and this is something that definitely affects gardeners or landscapers, what used to be a much more rare occurrence, those 2-3 inch plus rainfall events, are now happening much more frequently. Now, I know that's kind of hard to imagine because we just came out of a drought year, but again, this is an extreme place, so our extremes are becoming more extreme. Overall, Minnesota's getting much wetter, much wetter. A drought like we had last year is not a normal occurrence, but we still have weather and we still have climate, the bigger background picture. But our winter months are getting snowier because there is more water vapor in a warmer atmosphere, so that any storm that does develop has the potential to produce more snowfall. And then because you're multiplying it by, on average, 10, you know, a tenth of an inch of water might not seem like much, but multiply by 10, that's an extra inch of snow, you know, maybe in each particular snowfall event. So our storms are getting more powerful. And to go back to the Northeast, their storms are getting more powerful, those nor'easters, because water vapor are what these things are made out of. So if you have more of it, you're going to have more powerful storms, more precipitation, more snowfall. And while Minnesota is much warmer than it was 100 years ago, overall, it's still cold enough to snow more often than rain. So that's why we're seeing the increase in snowfall, but it's less dependable. So a snow lover might get excited and say, wow, we're averaging 4 inches more in a winter season than we did 100 years ago. Yeah, but our snow cover is actually averaging less than it was 100 years ago because we're seeing milder temperatures breaking that up. And so you can't depend on it. We all know that if anybody's a skier, I'm a skier, you know, how many years have we had to cancel events that were in January or February because 100 years ago when they set those, they're like, yeah, there's never not going to be snow at the end of January. You know, we were called in the 1800s, the Siberia of the United States is what they nicknamed Minnesota. And that's kind of, there's a cool history about like how the St. Paul Winter Carnival came out of that, because they were like capitalizing on it, trying to make it fun so that it wasn't just like, oh God, why would anyone want to settle out there? But yeah, the variations are normal, but snowfall is increasing, but it's also the most difficult thing to forecast. So while it's slightly easier to talk about what does our winter temperature outlook look like, much harder to say, okay, are we going to have above or below normal snowfall? Because that's the final variable. I always try to explain to people simply, you know, we use lots of equations to forecast weather, and the very end product, multiply, is going to be the precipitation. So that's going to be the least accurate thing of anything. And that's true in our 72-hour forecast, and it's true 6 months from now. And we should talk about, before we go too far in all this too, that we all know that forecasting a week out can change dramatically. So when we're talking about a winter forecast, we're literally talking about an educated guess here. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the winter. We're literally throwing a dart and hoping that we kind of know at least which way the wind's blowing so that the dart lands where we want it to.
One of the biggest things that really affects our gardens and the livelihood of plants, especially newer plants that have been installed, is snow cover, is the amount of moisture in the soil and that snow cover, because that snow cover gives insulation so that you don't, these temperature swings that we see, the soil doesn't get as affected by those temperature swings. Yep. Are there any major, what do the trends look like in the 45-day side of things? Are there any early snows that people are tracking at all at this point, or is it just not a thing that we could actually tell?
Yes. The answer is yes. The problem is we are still, even though it's harder to imagine in November than it is in July, we're still in a drought. We're way behind for precipitation. Right. And that pattern hasn't changed yet at all, which is part of the thing we have to look at for a winter forecast. So one of the things I'm looking at is kind of what, no matter what happens, unless we get just a gangbuster February, which has happened. You know, we've had a couple, the Super Bowl year, I believe, 2018, we had a snowy February. So that could make up the difference. But at least heading into the first part of winter, it is really difficult to see how we aren't still in a very dry pattern. And, you know, winter is a drought in itself anyway. We think of snowfall, but, you know, December, January, February precipitation averages about 1 inch of water equivalent. So it is our least wettest period of the year when you look at actual precipitation. So we're dealing with that too. But yeah, when we have a drought of the magnitude that we had this year, it almost never is just a 1 year event. This is likely going to be a 2 year dry period. Will next year be like this last year? Probably not. Hopefully not. But it's going to take a while to make up this deficit. We're over 6 inches behind for precipitation for the year. And when you only average 28 inches of precipitation a year, 6 inches is a lot of that. That's a big chunk. And people will remember that in August and September, we had made up a big chunk of that deficit. So at the beginning of August at our peak, we were just over 6 inches behind. And at that point, when you're talking about 6 inches behind and you're only a little halfway past the year, that's a huge deficit. So that is more meaningful than 6 inches behind in November. But we were only 3 inches behind after some beneficial rains in August and September. But then the spigot turned off. Second half of September, all of October, and so far November has been pretty dry. And so while we might, people listening to this will remember that it's the first snow of the season is coming up for many spots right around this middle part of November. We're maybe going to get 1 inch of water out of this storm. That won't make up a huge amount because every day that you don't get precipitation, you add to the deficit. So we really need a lot more water in the ground. It's impossible, basically, that this year will not end up below normal. We're not going to make up 6 inches of water here before December 31st. So I do think snowfall will be below normal, at least to start. And yeah, as you mentioned, the snowpack is beneficial for plants in the ground because even in a mild winter, it still usually gets below zero a couple times, and any delicate plant, that's not good. You don't want to be exposed to that. And, frost depth can grow pretty quickly when you have cold temperatures and nothing to insulate or cover it.
I want to circle back to something you said about how Minnesota is seeing some of the most climate change of any of the lower 48 states here. And can you talk a little bit about that and how is that specifically affecting our Minnesota winters?
The biggest thing that people have to understand is the fastest warming place on the planet is the Arctic. And so places that have a climate tied more closely to the Arctic are going to also be seeing some of the bigger changes. And so for Minnesota, that means in the winter, our weather can be quite often dominated by the Arctic. So that's why we're seeing some of the biggest changes. We get more Arctic conditions than New York or Florida, obviously. And the reason Alaska is changing faster than us is Alaska has Arctic territory. And so northern Minnesota versus southern Minnesota, same thing. Northern Minnesota gets more Arctic air. You have Hudson Bay and you have the whole Canadian Shield is sort of a climate zone in itself where cold air easily moves into those areas. So you'll see frequently, especially in the early and late winter, that northeastern Minnesota can have vastly different weather compared to us. There's just easier for air masses to clip that area. Lake Superior is the low spot in the region. It sort of sucks cold air in. So they get more of an Western Ontario climate than we do by far. And that's why anybody who loves going to the Boundary Waters, you notice it. It has an impact on the plants that grow there, the animals that live there, because it's a different climate. It's the beginning. It's that transition to taiga basically up there. So that's why northern Minnesota is seeing some of the bigger changes as well when you compare it to normals, because they are closer to more of an Arctic influence. But the changes that we're seeing, especially our warmer nights. Our nights are much warmer now in the winter. So when we're talking about being 2.5 degrees warmer than normal now compared to historically, that's maybe 1.5 to 2 degrees warmer on the high temperature end, but closer to 3-4 degrees warmer on the overnight temperature trend. And so this is where, how anyone would try to refute climate change anymore is beyond me. But this is textbook. This is how a greenhouse works. It's not that the greenhouse magnifies the sun or somehow creates heat out of nowhere. It's trapping heat. That's how our planet is warming with climate change. Heat isn't escaping at the rate that it should when there's less carbon dioxide, less methane, less of these greenhouse gases. So warmer nights is a perfect example of the fact that we are living in a greenhouse, literally. And the fact that winter is the fastest warming month period, not just for us, but in the Arctic. And people forget, people try to say, well, the few deniers out there still will say, oh, this is all because of the sun. There's cycles of the sun. Like, no, the Arctic is dark for 6 months. Has nothing to do with the sun. The fact that it's warming faster in the winter than the summer in the Arctic tells you this is obviously a greenhouse effect. And so we see a mini version of that. Our nights are much longer in the winter, of course. than the summer. So the fact that we're warming so fast at night tells us that we're trapping heat. We should be seeing temperatures plummet at night when we have, we're heading into the period now where we have 16 hours of night versus 8 hours a day. There should be a net cooling versus a net heating. And that's just not happening on the scale that it should and that it has historically. So nights are getting a lot warmer. And the other big thing are extremes. The extreme cold is warming much faster than any other periods. And some people, again, we might say, oh, is that a bad thing that we're not, 30, 40 below anymore? No, for a human, no. But, as you maybe talked about in your show, something like the emerald ash borer or invasive species, I think it's at 30, in the 30s below zero. That can kill off 90% of an emerald ash borer's eggs in the winter. So that's not going to happen here. But remember, in northeastern Minnesota, in that cold snap in February, I believe Hibbing and some of those Iron Range cities did get down to 35 below a couple times. So there's some real hope that maybe at least there that can slow the spread at least of an invasive species like that. So it does have an impact.
Right.
And while we don't like 35 below zero, all of our native species have evolved to that. Moose love the cold. They're made for it. Moose overheat in the summer when it's above 55 degrees. And when it's above, I think, 15 to 20 degrees in the winter, they start to overheat. And so warmer nights, warmer temperatures overall really affect things like moose. And I talk about moose a lot when I talk about Minnesota and climate because, globally we think of polar bears as the poster child of climate change. But in Minnesota, it's the moose. It's our biggest animal, and it's an animal that is almost certainly going to be extinct here, probably in our lifetimes, from Minnesota. It will still exist in Canada and Alaska. The climate's colder. Northern Minnesota is the southern fringe of their range, but the climate is just becoming to a point where it's not sustainable for them unless we take some drastic measures. And I'm not talking about lowering carbon emissions. That's something we have to do too, but we're going to have to humans are going to have the debate. Are we going to get involved to keep moose in Minnesota? What do we need to do that? So that's going off on a tangent, but it's those
I love it, yeah.
nights that are a huge change. So one of the things that's fascinating, I looked at this analysis last February because, whenever it gets cold, people say, oh, so much for climate change. Well, yeah, this is the key. That cold that came through us last February broke almost no records in Minnesota. So it was not that cold. It's compared to what we see normally in the last 20 years. Yeah, it's, it was legit cold. That's the kind of cold that we should be seeing, not just once in a winter every few years, but every winter a couple times. And so the fact that it's happening less frequently, it gets our attention now more than it would have before. But, 20 below zero is this interesting threshold for southern Minnesota, specifically in the Twin Cities that I wanted to analyze. And on average, historically, before 1900, we would hit 20 below zero 3 times per winter. So 3 nights per winter would get to 20 below zero or colder. Now the average is once every couple years. And that's just really averaging a couple of cold snaps over the last 20 years. So last winter, as cold as it got, 19 below was the coldest we got in the Twin Cities and that cold snap. So it wasn't even on that every other year threshold kind of cold. Our winters are just so much warmer that we've really kind of forgotten.
Right.
You and I remember the 80s. Anybody younger than us don't remember real winters anymore. Their perspective is completely off, so that when we get a big storm, a big snowstorm and followed by legit cold, they think, wow, the world's ending, when that used to be a much more common occurrence. So that extreme cold is what's really warming up. Our coldest winter temperature on average used to be about 25, 26 below zero. So basically looking at when you average the data out, you could count on your coldest night of the winter getting down into the mid 20s below zero. Now it's about 15 below.
Right.
That's a huge increase. So remember, we're talking about average winter temperatures warming up 2.5 degrees, but that coldest temperature of the winter is about 12 degrees warmer than it used to be. So that's a huge change. And again, when we're talking about invasive species and things like that,
absolutely,
that matters.
So we're bumping up against the end of our time together today. So I wanted to ask just one question and some couple quick fire questions. You may have already answered this, but what is one thing that you would want to hit home and make sure that Minnesotans really know and understand about climate change and what they really need to be focusing on today?
Well, I think part of it is kind of what I just touched on. I would love to do a whole psychology of climate change, because even us who've lived through some winters in the past, our whole perspective changes. We're used to a warmer world now, so that we need to step back and actually say, wow, this is unusual that we're actually finally seeing some cold, so like in February 2018, or the polar vortex winter, really stood out to us. But we need to remember that every winter. So I encourage people to just pay attention to those that are talking about climate. I try to bring a climate change angle into almost every weather forecast that I do, because daily there's something that we can relate climate to in just our normal 7-day forecast. So try to pay attention to those things, because you almost do have to look at the numbers, because you're not going to notice some of the, other specific trends. A great example, that it was this last summer. It was our hottest summer ever, and people were shocked, even myself, because I remember 1988, and, there aren't as many people alive who remember the 1930s, but we beat out those summers, which is insane. But it was the consistent heat. So you do have to almost look at the actual data to see that. Normal summers like 1988 still had remnants of a normal summer. You have variation. In the 1930s, you had big variations, normal cool snaps in June and August. We didn't have that this year. So that's why we ended up hotter than anything that we've ever recorded. So yeah, try to pay attention to the numbers as best as you can. You don't have to be a math person, but
exactly. And
listen to those.
And
of us
we will
who
put
are.
also links to the show notes to a lot of that different information that you've got, and link so that people can look at that themselves and see where everything's at. So we end our podcast with a couple different quickfire type questions for you. And we'll start with, what is your favorite place in Minnesota to visit?
Oh, I think I already alluded the Boundary Waters. I love going up there, and Isle Royale, which is technically part of Michigan, and why I don't know, but yeah, I love that North Woods, and that is an area that is really in our own state the fastest changing. So it's sort of fascinating / sad to go there and see that it's already very different than it used to be. I've been lucky enough to go to the Arctic a couple of times, and every time I'm there, I sort of have to pause and think, wow, this is different than when the great explorers came. And my nephews and nieces, if they ever get here, won't see what I'm seeing. So really appreciate what we have right now, because our climate, no matter, we've got the summit going on in Glasgow, no matter what we do, our climate is going to continue to change, and species will continue to disappear. This is the point we need to really pound home to people, is that we are trying to prevent catastrophe at this point, not trying to prevent the planet from changing. It's already done that, and will still a little bit more.
Next question is, what is your favorite food that is grown in Minnesota?
My favorite food sweet corn. Yeah, Minnesota sweet corn, because I think we all know you can't get corn that's been on a truck for 5 days or
exactly.
more.
What is essential reading for you?
Oh, Song of the Dodo Bird. I can't remember the author, but if you really like the intersection of, which I do, all sort of sciences and history, it's a really good book where he talks about the dodo bird, one of our species that on the planet that went extinct. And he talks about how species evolved, in Indonesia specifically, but he talks about why islands specifically are prone to extinction. So I've been lucky enough to go to the Galapagos a couple times and all over Indonesia. And you have all these unique species, and how weather, climate, and geology all come together, and then how humans are literally the grenade in all of this. And then talking about people like Darwin and other people before Darwin, who actually he can credit a lot of what his theories were to people who came before him. And it's just fascinating. If you like history, climate, weather, just science overall, it really
I haven't read
touches
that
on
one.
all
I'll have
of
to
those.
put that one on the list.
And National Geographic magazine. I'm sure a lot of people, but I like getting that monthly, what's the latest stuff in the world that's cool.
And then last question is, just so you know, this comes from my 10-year-old daughter, Isla. We were figuring out what to do with these questions at the end.
So probably the hardest one, actually.
It absolutely is, but it's the best one for sure. And it is, if you were a plant, what plant would you be?
Wow.
See, I told you.
Maybe, yeah. Wow. Huh? There's so few of those left. Immortality, don't we all want to live forever? I mean, those are one of our oldest tree species in the state. I know there's some cedars, but a white pine, like, think if you could be one of the few white pine that are still, I don't know if we must have a couple virgin white pine left.
Yeah.
Think of the stuff they've seen.
Do you want to recap real quick just what your expectations are? Temperature, precipitation wise, what you think will happen this winter, and then also tell people about what you've got going on and where to find more information about you.
Yeah, so overall, I think temperatures are going to even out being pretty close to normal. So last year we were slightly warmer than normal. I think this winter will be slightly colder than last, but it'll probably be a mild start to the winter like we've been seeing. So one of the changes from the 30-year normals is Decembers are getting much, much warmer. And that kind of lines up with what I think people's impressions are. It seems like winter's getting a later start, and the data actually shows that. Decembers are getting milder. Februarys are actually one of the only months, there's only 2 months in our 12-month calendar that has gotten colder than normal in the new 30-year normals, February and April. And that's the influence of these polar vortex outbreaks, which there's some really interesting, we could do a whole podcast on this, that they think that maybe there's more disruptions to the polar vortex because we're warming up the planet in the Arctic specifically. But so we're getting some of these weird cold outbreaks like last February sometimes that throw the numbers off. I don't know. February could have another, predicting that kind of detail. 2 weeks of really cold weather is hard to do. It's a lot easier to look and say, what's the overall winter temperature pattern? So I think slightly cooler than normal from last year. So a normal winter, but slightly cooler than last year's temperatures. And as far as precipitation, I think it'll be a dry start to winter, drier than normal at least. And then maybe hopefully the second half gets closer to normal snowfall, but it's really hard to say. Precipitation is going to be the hardest thing to predict this winter, because if we do get into some extended cool snaps, that really can shut off the snow machine. So we'll see on that front.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And where can people learn more? And you've got some cool things coming up.
Yeah, so you can check out my video forecast, Bring Me the News. Follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook, YouTube, what else? Everything. That's where I primarily put a lot of my weather stuff, and then just constantly, I have Twitter updates, several of them through the day. Simple things like, hey, we're at 69. We're about to hit 70 for the first time this season. So those fun little things. And then by this point, Patreon, that's where you can find my winter forecast in detail, or Facebook on my fan page. You can subscribe there, and that's where I'm going to have more in-depth weather content, much more weather and climate and conservation content, and things like seasonal and monthly forecasts, trying to look at, the extended period, what we have in store. And yeah, I do lots of deep dives into statistical analyses. And so if you're into that nerdy stuff, I got a lot of that.
Yeah, the nerdy stuff is right in my wheelhouse. So that's perfect. So, well, Sven Sundgaard, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate your time and sharing just all your awesome knowledge with everyone here today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Have a great rest of your day.
Sir.
See what I mean? Sven was just so much fun to talk with, and just an absolute wealth of information and knowledge on weather here in Minnesota and what we can expect or not expect for our winter season. And Sven has a brand new, he alluded to it during the podcast, but he has a brand new Patreon account where you can support him. And if you go to our website in the show notes at minnesotagardening.com/12, you'll find a link to his Patreon account, and we'll be able to get a lot of great information and new things that he doesn't share publicly, only for members. So it's a really great thing. So with that, we have another wonderful episode for you next week. We're going to be talking about indoor gardening with microgreens and how to grow vegetables over the winter season and eat healthy still. So with that, I will see you next week.